Hi there and welcome to today's vlog. Now, just in case you notice some red spots on my collar here and you think, "Oh, has he been bleeding?" Well, no, I haven't, you're right. Um, this morning I've been out painting some of our boundary fence, the particular bit where hopefully next week the summer house will be positioned. So we thought that it'd be much more or much easier to get it done before the summer house is situated than after. So fortunately we had a bit of dry weather this morning, and so I got out there, spent just about most of the morning painting away, and of course some of it dripped in different places, including on my collar. I'm not quite sure how that got there, but there you go. That's just in case you're worried that I'm somehow cut myself, but there you go. A book to tell you about. I just finished reading, really fascinating, challenging, inspiring. It's called From Prison to Pulpit, the life story of Reverend John Maillard. John Maillard was a primitive Methodist preacher. He was born in Hereford in, the year 1816. So over 200 years ago. The Primitive Methodist Church was an offshoot of the Wesleyan Methodist Church. It's quite a long story, but it's kind of a renewal movement that couldn't be contained within the then Wesleyan Church. So the Primitive Methodist Church was in its early years at that time when John Maillard was born. Incidentally, the Methodist churches came together again in 1932-33. But anyway, he was a young lad, a bit of a rum lad, but he came to faith. He started ministering and evangelizing and preaching. He became a minister, official minister within the Primitive Methodist Church. And this is the story of his life. He travelled around many different places, because in those days you usually stayed for a maximum of 3 years in any one situation. These days it can be much longer, but usually these days the minimum is about 5 years. But he travelled in many different places, although he did see much growth in different places, people responding to the gospel. At the same time, he kind of had a really tough time, not least because the Primitive Methodist Church tended to minister to the poorer element of society, the very working class people, that the rest of the church seemed to ignore. And I just want to read to you a couple of or 3 passages from the book. Incidentally, I will be getting on to the third bit of our look at Habakkuk, but this really fits in to that. He wrote a diary, and a lot of this book is based largely on his diary entries. December 16th. Remember, whenever he went out to preach, he would usually walk. Didn't have motor cars, didn't have other transport. December 16th, walked 15 miles through the rain to Elcombe. Had a great meeting for 3 hours in my wet clothes. Some were converted, but I suffered much from the cold I took. So imagine walking 15 miles, getting soaking wet, taking a service. You're there 3 hours in your soaking wet clothes. And sometimes people didn't really offer him much assistance. Of course, he endured privation and persecution during his ministry. At South Carney, after preaching one night, he inquired for a bed. In other words, he asked the church for anybody got a spare bed. But he could not obtain one, so he just had to make his bed on the forms in the chapel. So he just laid down on one of the wooden pews. In the morning, Mr. Maillard arose and went in search of breakfast, but had to walk several miles before he found anyone sufficiently hospitable to entertain him. Can you just imagine that? You slept all night on a rough, hard wooden pew, go see church members and ask anybody got a bit of food for breakfast, and he's turned away, so he has to walk another several miles. And not only did he suffer neglect from his own church people at times, partly because they were very poor themselves. He didn't have when he travelled to new places, he wasn't given amounts like ministers are today. One occasion he goes there to this new place, he's got to find somewhere to rent for him and his family. He finds his 2-room apartment or place where he can live, at least 2 bedrooms. He's got 3 or 4 children by then, and there's no furniture at all in the bedroom. So he asks, have anybody got a spare bed? No. So he has to go to the farmer, get a load of straw, lay it on the floor, and the children sleep on the straw. Terrible. And the final bit I want to read you, because he suffered great persecution, the early Methodists, the nonconformists as they were called. 4 days later, the missionary, that's Mr. Maillard, again made his appearance. For some time proceeded with the service without interruption. But just as he was about to cease preaching, a rabble assembled with bells, old frying pans, etc., and made a great noise. At once he closed the service, but the crowd followed, rang the bells in his ears, shouted like madmen. Someone threw an old kettle upon his head. Then they took him and threw him into a deep ditch. As he crawled out, severe blows were struck at his head. In protecting his head, his hands were cut and bled profusely. Completely exhausted, he sat down on some stones, wept and prayed, expecting that he would be killed. A great suffering these preachers went through, and yet they were men of God, people of faith. And that leads us quite nicely to, we'll be looking at some 5 pegs from the book of the prophet Habakkuk. The first one, remember that God is okay with our questions. The second one, God sees the big picture when we often can't. And then the third peg, and I'll try and make this quite brief, is that God calls us to faithfulness. This book about John Maillard is a great example of a man who suffered greatly, who was tempted to give in, especially when he saw his family suffering. Several of his children died. His first wife died. In that book of Habakkuk, in chapter 2, verse 3, it says, the revelation awaits an appointed time. God's timing is perfect, and it's not always coincidental with our it doesn't always coincide with our timing, does it? Sometimes we're kind of get impatient with God to move, God to do something, God to answer our prayer, but God sometimes has very different timing to ours. So we're called to put our faith in God, even when his timing is different, even when we can't understand things, to trust despite the circumstances we may be facing. In chapter 2, verse 4, it says, the righteous shall live by faith. A better translation probably would be, the righteous person will live by their faithfulness. In other words, to live the faithful life, to keep on trusting in God, keep on believing whatever happens, keep on trusting in God, saying to God, God, I put my trust in you, whatever may happen. I mentioned, I think, recently when my brother Phil died, my young brother, and there is that time sometimes when something terrible happens to ourselves or to others, and we have that temptation to give in. But no, God calls us to put our trust in him, just like John Maillard did. And he went through far greater suffering than probably most of us will do, and yet he kept on to the end, served God for many, many years in different places despite everything. And in some places he saw a great revival breaking out because he was faithful. There's an account in the Gospels where some of Jesus' disciples, those who were following him, found them going hard and they left and they deserted Jesus. And Jesus turned to the 12 and says, are you going to leave me too? And Peter says, Lord, to whom should we go? For you have the words of eternal life. And the reality is that, yes, we can choose to give up on God. But if we do so, who are we going to then trust in? Where else can we turn? Peter knew very well that in Jesus is the source of true life. So the call is to faithfulness. That's the third peg, if you like, to hang on our thoughts on the book of Habakkuk. And we have examples of so many men and women of God through the years, just like John Maynard, who, despite everything they faced, kept on trusting in God. And my prayer is that I and you will, whatever the future may bring for us, continue to trust in God. There's that lovely setting of the modern setting of the 23rd Psalm, which has the chorus, and I will trust in you. May that be true of us. God bless you. Thank you so much for listening today.